Okay, I think oh, I see a lot of people are coming right now, and yeah, okay.
Do you want me to share my presentation
yes,
now?
Please, yeah, if you can, please.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes, yeah, we see that clearly. Yeah. Brilliant. So shall I give some information about Professor Serratrice? She's a professor of multilingualism. She's a director of the Center for Literacy and Multilingualism. She's from University of Reading, from School of Psychology and Clinical Language Sciences. Her areas of interest include language development in monolingual and multilingual context, discourse pragmatics in connections to the use and acquisition of reference, processing of complex syntactic construction in school-age children, metalinguistic awareness in multilingual children, sentence level processing in adult bilingual. Professor, I think you're okay, and we see the slides very well, so you can start, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Mohammed, for the introduction, and Rana Al-Saban for the invitation, and all of you for being here today. When Rana approached me, she basically asked me to share some of my sort of recent thoughts that I put together in this in the chapter that was recently published in a book. So I thought the opportunity of going back to that and then putting some thoughts together, and also let you a little bit know about what I think about bilingualism, why I think it's important to study it, and I'll be very interested to see what you've got to say. So I'll talk a little bit about the heterogeneity of the bilingual experience and the challenges and opportunities that it provides. And then I will focus on two, I don't want to say case studies, but anyway, two aspects of language development that I think have got something interesting to tell us about language development in general, not just about bilingual language development. And specifically word learning and the relationship between speed of processing, word learning, and language-specific input. And then I'll talk about shared syntactic representations in bilingual children and what they can tell us about, about the architecture of bilingualism. Oh, and now what's going on? Sorry, don't understand why. Maybe I just have to go here. All right, okay, I'll just use this arrow. Okay, so just a couple of words about what I call the monolingual mindset. That is the idea that speaking one language is the norm, and that it is the blueprint for the study of language with a capital L, right? And I think, of course, there are many reasons, and we could do like a whole sociological, historical, sociopolitical course on why this is the way it is, but mostly it's because the people that have started sort of driving sort of the study of language acquisition were in the global north, coming mostly from monolingual societies, and therefore they thought that that was the way language works, when in fact we know that this approach to language development and language use in general is actually quite problematic, because in practical terms, monolingualism is certainly not the norm in many parts of the world. But also from a theoretical perspective, as I hope we will show, taking monolingualism as the default is actually quite reductive and potentially misleading, because it may hide important information and may lead us down the wrong path. So as I'm sure we all know, bilinguals are a very heterogeneous group, and the term bilingualism is extremely broad and really includes children that vary tremendously along a different dimension. So for example, the societal context in which they're brought up, their family environment, the language and the schooling that they've got access to in maybe both or maybe only one of their languages, and also the typological distance between the languages that they're learning. I mean, these are only some of the issues, but some important ones. And therefore, heterogeneity sort of really means that we have to think carefully about the kind of claims that we make about bilingual language development, because they're at least partly shaped by the kind of bilinguals that you're talking about. one case in point. I'm not going to go into this thorny debate, but I'm sure most of you who are familiar with the current literature will have heard about the big debate on the bilingual cognitive advantage, and that sort of, again, a lot of the infighting, I would say, that is out in the field is probably at least partly explained by the fact that people may be talking about different types of bilinguals when they're making these claims, and when they find or don't find an advantage. So different societal context, again, sort of, you may be in a society where two languages have got official status and there is educational support for both of them, or de facto bilingual communities. And I think Saudi may be one of them, where maybe, there is one official language, but actually there are a lot of opportunities for bilingual education. And of course, English would be the case. A lot of people do use English, children may be going to bilingual schools. And then other, examples still where you've got pockets of bilingual communities or individual bilingual families in which there is really no formal educational support. So for the non-official, for the minority language. So all the input really is in more naturalistic kind of context, potentially inside the family or the local community. Family constellation, of course, makes a huge difference, and the parents' own bilingual status. Obviously, in families where there are two parents that speak a minority language, the child is much more likely to acquire the language as opposed to when only one of the parents does. We also know the input from several different speakers, so the number of speakers is also more conducive to language development than the same amount. In terms of hours of exposure, but from a smaller number of speakers, or maybe even just one. Also, we know that the input from speakers that use their non-native language for children, or that have limited proficiency in that language, is also less conducive to language development, the input that comes from native speakers. And there are many reasons for this that I could go into later on. Also, birth order. Those of you who've got more than one child will probably also know that clearly, all the children bring, school and the outer community in the home. So in the case of families in which at home they speak a minority language, being a second or third born child really exposes you to a lot more of the societal language than if you're the firstborn. Of course, we all know the age of first exposure to two languages also makes a difference, because whether you're exposed to two languages pretty much from birth or soon after makes a difference, as opposed to learning a language when you are a sequential bilingual and you've got a first language that is pretty much well established. Code switching is another important aspect of the bilingual dimension, of course, there are many different types of contexts in which, bilingual speakers code switch. You can find yourself in a single language context in which you predominantly use one language in one environment and the second language in a very different environment. For example, home is, only the heritage minority language, and outside of the home is the societal language. Or you could have a dual language context in which you do use both languages, but typically with different speakers. Or even more, more code switching when you've got a dense code switching environment in which speakers do a lot of intersentential code switching and intersentential code switching with a lot of speakers as a rule. So all of these aspects that I've just sort of mentioned, sort of really, it's not news. I don't think I'm breaking, I'm giving you a major piece of news when I'm telling you that bilingualism really has come to be understood not as a dichotomous variable, either you're bilingual or you're not bilingual, but more really as a continuous variable. How bilingual are you? It depends, and you really need to take account into very many different aspects, and some of which I just mentioned. We also know that there is a plethora of parental questionnaires that they're out there. I'm involved in a project called the Cubex project, and we've just published one paper. One is coming out very soon. On the first paper actually took stock of the very many different questionnaires that are out there that have been used to quantify the bilingual experience. So because there were so many different ones, we just thought, well, we probably need yet another one. So this is why we came together as an international consortium consortium, really to try and harmonize the approaches to the quantification of the bilingual experience, because we really thought that the field was ripe for something a little bit more systematic and see where the similarity and differences are and the ways in which we can ask these questions, so that when we're comparing across studies, we're actually talking about the same thing. Because even a very, trivial question like, how much are you exposed to language X, depending on the way in which it is asked, makes comparison across studies very difficult, because we're really measuring things in a different way. So I put the link out there. I'm very happy to share the slides later on, so if people want to have a look. We have in the making sort of several translations of the tool. One of them is in Arabic, and there are several others that are being prepared, and a few ones that are already out there. So if you're interested, by all means, check out the project, because you can find more information out there, not just for researchers, but also for speech and language therapists and teachers. So as I said, just a little bit of context to talk about the challenges and opportunities that studying bilingual children entail. So challenges, obviously, because when you're dealing with such a heterogeneous population, there are so many different things that you have to take into account. Your recruitment, in many cases, will be quite a bit more difficult than if you're just going for your standard monolingual child. And I'm talking in places where monolingualism is more pervasive. If you're targeting specific language combinations or language combinations in conjunction with other aspect of the child's experience, it becomes even more difficult. I'm thinking of one of my PhD students, for example, who I know is in the audience, who is looking at deaf children who are bilingual in 2 spoken languages. So that's quite a niche kind of population. So recruitment can be hard, and many things need to be sort of controlled when you're doing research with bilinguals. But at the same time, studying bilingual children really offers a fantastic opportunity to tease apart and to learn more about what are child internal factors, the things that children bring to the language learning task, and what they get from the language environment. There is constantly this, nature nurture debate. It's obviously neither one or the other, but trying to figure out where the balance lies is actually quite difficult. And I would argue that studying bilingual children, as I hope I'll show in the rest of the talk, actually gives us a leg up when it comes to really sort of delving deeper into this issue. So what's the task in bilingual language development? Well, basically, essentially, the same as it is for monolingual children, right? Because like monolingual children, bilingual children need to learn the conventional way in which the language that they're learning maps meaning onto form, in a very basic way. But they also sort of need to do this for 2 languages. So they need to learn the language-specific packaging of meaning and form when it comes to lexical constructions and syntactic constructions. Differently from monolingual children, obviously, the mapping may be the same or different across languages, right? And of course, again, depending on the language combination, the typological distance may also have an effect on how the form meaning mapping are similar or different. So, for example, children that are learning Spanish and Catalan in Spain, there are a lot of cognates, the level of lexical constructions between the 2 languages, and also when it comes to syntactic constructions, there are a lot of similarities, a lot of overlap. But if you're looking at, for example, a child that is learning English and Mandarin, that is not the case, right? So clearly, the extent to which that you can have some sort of bilingual bootstrapping in languages that are very different will probably not be the same as in languages that are very similar. So what I'm going to sort of talk about now is an example in which studying bilingual children can help us, like I said, disentangle some aspect of what is, to do with the makeup of the child, what they bring to the language learning task, and what comes from the environment, the external factors. So specifically, I'm talking here about vocabulary size, okay, so word learning, and whether this is predicted. I mean, of course, it is predicted by both, but in what relationship? So, how big a child's vocabulary is will depend on how much input they receive in that language. There's quite a trivial statement, but it would also depend on how fast they are at processing language input. Okay, so language comes to us thick and fast, and it takes about 200 milliseconds on average to recognize a word in the speech stream. So it's a fast kind of enterprise. So lexical processing, speed of processing, is going to be really important, an important aspect of word learning. And of course, if you're fast, if you're efficient at learning words, it means that you can go down, and then obviously people don't normally speak to you in single words, they speak to you in phrases and sentences. And if you recognize words quickly, then you're freeing up some of the processing energy to then focus on syntactic relationships and these syntactic relationships that will map onto semantics, so to make sense of what is being said to you, right? If you're having difficulties in mapping a phonological form onto a label, onto a meaning, then of course that's going to hold you back. So if you're losing, if you don't get the first word in the sentence, if you're spending time to try and figure out what that word means, of course you will miss out on the rest of the sentence, and therefore there'll be no syntactic parsing and no meaning construction. So like I was saying, in bilingual children, we can disentangle individual child internal factors, but also external factors like input. So we can get a clearer picture of the way in which these things interact. So when it comes to looking at word knowledge, vocabulary size, I mean, I'm sure those of you who work in the developmental field will have heard of the Mercator CDI, the Communicative Development Inventory, which is basically a parental vocabulary checklist that has been used very successfully to assess the size of children's vocabularies, both monolingual and bilingual children. So they're a good measure offline measure of lexical knowledge. Again, I don't know to what extent people here are familiar with online methods, but the listening while looking paradigm, where children are presented visually with two pictures, and then they hear a linguistic stimulus, for example, find the ball, and they've got a picture of a ball and a picture of, I don't know, a bucket, and then the measuring how quickly children look at the correct picture, how quickly they do this label matching task, is a measure of their speed of lexical processing. And the more efficient children are at processing lexical labels, of course, the faster they will orient towards the correct picture. So that's a measure of how efficient they are at doing this kind of processing. So the research that has looked at this type of real-time lexical recognition in both monolingual and bilingual children has repeatedly found a positive relationship between lexical processing and vocabulary size. So children that are faster at doing this kind of task are also children that have got bigger vocabularies. And I put a few references here. Interestingly, those studies that also included a measure of language input found that lexical processing, so how fast they were, mediated the relationship between input and vocabulary. So essentially, even if you hold the amount of input constant, those children that are better at doing this kind of lexical recognition task will be the ones that will learn words faster and will have a bigger vocabulary. Because in essence, input provides children an opportunity to exercise those speech segmentation and lexical recognition skills that are key to learning language. In the case of a monolingual child, though, when you're finding this relationship in the case of a monolingual child, it is difficult to know whether, because of course, in the case of monolingual child, well, first of all, input is 100% in one language, but of course, even in the case of monolingual children, we know that there are some children that have got more input than others, even if it's 100% of the total amount of input that they get. But like I said, so it's difficult to know whether a child is doing the task because because of the input they're receiving, because they're better at doing this kind of, they're more proficient anyway. Keeping one constant and manipulating the other is really not an option. This is where studying bilingual children can provide a more definitive answer, because you've got one child. So, in theory, the same processing skills, but you've got two languages in which input may vary. So essentially, you can make different predictions, right? So if processing skills are just something that the child is equipped with, right, and it's an individual sort of characteristic trait of the child, you would predict that they would be just as efficient as learning words in one language as the other, and regardless of the amount of input that they receive in those two languages, just purely because it's a trait of the child to be a fast, efficient lexical processor, so to speak. But actually, if lexical processing efficiency is shaped by the amount of input that children receive, then you would make a different prediction. So then you would expect that there would be a significant relationship within languages, so that the child would be more efficient in the language in which they receive more input relatively to the other language. Okay, so you would make different predictions. So let's see what people have found in monolingual and bilingual children. This is a study that was specifically on bilingual children, tested, with this listening while looking paradigm when they were 13 and 36 months. And I've just just summarize the main findings here. So the first one is a rather trivial finding, and that is, but it's good to find that, because obviously sort of it's repeated over time. So the relative exposure was positively associated to children's relative vocabulary size. So children that had more exposure to Spanish than English knew more words in Spanish than in English. Okay, so that's, it's something that you would expect. It's not particularly novel. The interesting thing was that the relative lexical processing efficiency, so how fast children were at doing the task in English and in Spanish, was linked to vocabulary knowledge in the two languages. Okay, so there was a very language specific relationship. So children who knew more words in Spanish compared to English were also faster to access those words in Spanish than in English. Okay, so it seems to be quite a language specific relationship here. So it really suggests that their skills at lexical recognition are not just a trait of the child, an invariant trait of the child, but they are really related, intimately connected to the input. And the third finding really sort of speaks to this, because children that had more exposure to Spanish than English were relatively more efficient at recognizing words in Spanish than in English. Okay, so again, so remember the initial two different predictions that we had. The findings of this study, this was the first study that showed this, but these findings have been replicated in other studies and in other language combinations as well. This really brings things together. And so studying bilingual children, where you're keeping the child constant, but you are not manipulating as such, is just by virtue of the fact that bilingual children often have different amounts of exposure in two languages. So this really shows that this within language relationship is really crucial, and really shows that word knowledge, lexical processing, and word knowledge are really language specific, okay, and they're not just a feature of the child. And like I said, with monolingual children, you can't, you could sort of do that to some extent in varying the amount of language that the children are exposed to, but that's a harder thing to do and also you would be comparing different children. The beauty of doing this with bilingual children is that the child is always the same, so you're controlling for, their own controls, so to speak. So in summary, children do come to the language learning task endowed with a set of processing skills, but these skills are really shaped by the linguistic environment that they have access to. So the language specific nature of this link between relative amount of exposures and relative lexical processing efficiency is really a very concrete example of how research with bilingual children can inform our understanding of language with a capital L, right? So these are the kind of things, the kind of questions that are much harder to answer if you're going at it with a monolingual mindset. Again, for those of you who are interested in word learning, I didn't put it in today's presentation, but it's something that I do talk about in the chapter. Another very interesting example is mutual exclusivity, right? The extent to which children sort of learn new word by applying mutual exclusivity constraints. So people that have done this with bilingual children have actually found that their relative experience with the languages and the number of translation equivalents that they've got across language really shapes the extent to which they apply mutual exclusivity constraints or not. So again, mutual exclusivity is not a universal constraint that applies across the board, but is really shaped by the kind of language experience that children have. And bilingual children have got a different language experience from monolingual children. So that tells us something about heuristics, about language learning strategies, and the way in which they're not just a universal construct, but really shaped by the kind of way in which children interact with their immediate environment. So I think in the interest of time, I will probably move to syntax now. So just again, a very sort of brief evolution of the way in which people have been thinking about the relationship between syntactic representation in bilingual children. And in some ways, I think we're going back to full circle, but not quite. So I'll explain what I mean. So very early on, when people sort of, I mean, I'm not saying that this is the first study that had looked at this. There were, certainly very influential studies like Leopold's studies, for example, in the 50s before that. But Voltaire and Teschen, I think, were probably the first that really sort of tried to put down, pen to paper and just say, okay, what do we think about syntactic differentiation and lexical differentiation? And really, their proposal was that at the beginning, there was really no differentiation between two syntactic systems in the children, and they really proposed this one system account, okay? Later on, sort of people that have reanalyzed their data actually showed, and also in other ways as well, by looking at morphosyntactic development, they really sort of showed that actually maybe, the way in which Voltaire and Teschen analyzed their data was not really doing justice to what children could do, because they weren't really looking at the interlocutor to which they were speaking, and whether they were more or less likely to use language A with speaker of language A and language B with speaker of language B. So in the, say, late 80s and early 90s, the two-system model came on board, and what really the idea is that children do have and are quite sensitive to the fact that there are two different syntactic representations, different linguistic systems in their input, and they replicate these differentiations. At the same time, there was this big drive at the time to just say, well, now, bilingual children all are not confused. They do have two different syntactic representations. They are more likely to use syntax A in language A and syntax B in language B than vice versa. At the same time, we also know that bilingual children do things that monolingual children don't do. And people sort of looking at, although there is syntactic differentiation, there may still be pockets, areas where you can expect some pretty systematic cross-linguistic influence. Okay, so, I would say that for the last 20 years or so, people have devoted a lot of time to finding the predictors of this cross-linguistic influence. So we know that it happens, we know that it's a defining feature of being a bilingual speaker, but can we predict when it will happen or not? What does predict that? I mean, is it language dominance? Is it degree of overlap? Is it, typological distance? That all of these things obviously are important, and people are still really very much trying to figure out all the various, also the areas. Is it just, initially people proposed that it was really just in the area of pragmatics, and then we said, actually, no, semantics is involved as well. And there are cases in which you can go beyond interfaces and you've got cross-linguistic influence in the purely syntactic domain. So, a variety of ways in thinking about it. The reason why I'm saying that we may have gone back to, full circle is because actually lately, people have started sort of talking about shared syntax. Okay, so this is something that has been going on for quite a while in the adult psycholinguistics literature, and in the context of a methodological paradigm called syntactic priming. And the idea is that you're much more likely to reuse a syntactic construction if you've been recently exposed to this syntactic construction, either in production or comprehension. So the idea is that, and I was one of the people that did say this like way back in 2007, I think, is that perhaps the reason why we have cross-linguistic influence is that children are actually priming themselves across languages. Okay, just to give you an example, much of my work at the time, and maybe to a lesser extent more recently, but was on pronouns. Okay, so the use of pronouns in languages that do have them, and like English, of course, and in languages like Italian, where pronouns exist, but their distribution is regulated by pragmatics. Okay. So one of the repeated findings, and I was not the only person that found that, these findings have been replicated again and again, is that bilingual speakers, not just children, anyway, speakers that have a language where pronouns, subject pronouns are obligatory, like English, pretty much all the time, and languages like Italian or maybe Spanish, where subject pronouns can only occur in certain pragmatic constraint, in certain pragmatic domain. The typical finding was that the bilinguals that have these two languages tended to overproduce and over-accept pronouns in Italian or Spanish or Greek, where they really shouldn't appear. And, the argument was, well, maybe, they are they're using pronouns in English all of the time. They hear pronouns in English all of the time, to the extent that they are priming themselves across languages in using these pronouns in the other language as well, right? So you're doing something, and what you're going to do when you're switching languages, this structure is still active, and it will be reused in the other language. So the idea, if that is the case, then you would expect to be some sort of a degree of syntactic representation that is shared across languages, and not in the context of cross-linguistic influence specifically, but this is the claim that has been made for for adult bilingual speakers. And here are some of the references. So the idea from cross-linguistic priming in bilingual children, for some reason, there is like a huge amount of literature in second language acquisition. So, in adult bilingual speakers for cross-linguistic priming. A lot of work there. But for some reason, to me, it seems like the obvious thing to do. Evidence from cross-linguistic priming in bilingual children is still really limited. I have to say, I'm expecting like a surge of papers coming out in the next year or so, because I've been to quite a few conferences over the last year or two, and I've seen a lot of work done on cross-linguistic influence and priming in bilingual children. So I'm expecting quite a lot of stuff to come out soon. But at the moment, I've put here the papers that have been published so far. And if anybody knows of anything more recent, please do let me know. So I'd say, the first one was this study in 2010, where they were looking at Spanish, English, bilingual children, unbalanced, across their two languages, so more dominant in one language than the other. And they found one-way priming of passives from Spanish to English. So when they heard a prime, an example, a model of a passive in Spanish, and then they had to describe a transitive event in English, they were more likely to use a passive in English when they had just heard a passive in Spanish, as opposed to when they had heard an active in Spanish. So but the other way around didn't happen. A more recent paper showed bidirectional priming. Again, the same structure, but this time they found it in both directions because these children, they argue, were more balanced. And therefore, that's why they observed the priming in both directions. And then there are a couple of papers, another one that looked at priming within languages and across languages. Okay, so you would say, if the syntactic representation are shared across languages, you would expect no difference in within language priming. So, for example, English to English or Norwegian to Norwegian, and cross language priming, Norwegian to English or English to Norwegian, right? And this is what Bolleb and colleagues found for a group of Norwegian English bilingual children when they're looking at the dative alternation. And then to date, as far as I'm aware, Sin et al. Are the only people that have tried to use priming to prime ungrammatical word order. Okay, so what they did, Spanish and English have got adjectival noun phrases, but in English, the adjective precedes the noun, so a black dog. And in Spanish, it typically follows the noun. So, the equivalent of a dog black, right? Un perro nero. So they managed to get these bilingual Spanish-English children to say things like un nero perro, literally a black dog in Spanish, which is a word order that is ungrammatical. Okay, so I would argue that this is, the first, example of cases in which maybe, the priming hypothesis underlying cross-linguistic influence may be along the right lines. So, like I said, at the moment, 3 of the 4 studies that have used cross-linguistic priming do lend some support to the idea that syntactic representations may be shared in bilingual children. And the issue that language dominance is relevant because we've seen, absence of priming in unbalanced bilinguals, but bidirectional priming in balanced bilinguals. And of course, just a word again about the role of the input. Bilingual children, are likely to receive input from adult speakers who may be either a non-native speaker of the language. Okay, so for example, I'm not a native speaker of English, so my English is not the same as a monolingual English speaker. At the same time, because my first language is Italian, but I have lived in an English-speaking country for half of my life now. So my Italian is also not the same as that of an Italian monolingual speaker that has never left Italy. So I'm one of those attritive speakers. I don't particularly like the word, but people that have, lost some of, their language. I wouldn't say maybe language knowledge, but lexical access is certainly one of the things that goes, but also my grammatical intuitions. And I don't know if this happens to, those of you who are bilingual and they're constantly, switching from one language to the other. Sometimes I don't have very good intuitions about what is acceptable in Italian or not anymore. Okay, especially when it comes to these fine pragmatic or semantic distinctions. I mean, I'm very aware of, blatant ungrammaticalities, but when it's quite a nuanced distinction, and especially if it's something that is, completely acceptable in English, my intuitions are certainly not like the ones of a monolingual Italian speaker in Italy. So, just to say that the kind of input in Italian that I would provide to a child learning Italian in England, for example, even if I'm speaking Italian, is not the same kind of Italian that a monolingual child would get from a parent. Also, interestingly, this is something that has really not been looked at in the literature very much at all, as far as I know, when it comes to bilingual children or monolingual, you know, or bilingual adults for that matter. This idea that, you know, there are a lot of children, and again, you know, this may be the situation for some of you in your bilingual, multilingual families, who understand the heritage language, you know, so you could have a, you know, the case of, I don't know, a Polish child in England who understands Polish, his parents, you know, still speak Polish to them. But they answer in English. Okay, so this is quite a frequent situation in which children, especially when they start going to school, stop speaking in the heritage language or speak it a lot less, but the parents continue, and, you know, good for them. So you've got this kind of, you know, natural experiment of cross-linguistic priming set up, because, you know, the parents speak in Polish, the child is answering in English. So they're hearing Polish, they're parsing Polish, they're understanding Polish, they're parsing syntactic construction in Polish, which remain pretty active, and then they answer in English. So it is very likely that, you know, a syntactic representation that has just been parsed in comprehension could potentially affect the production in English, right? So this is like a natural experiment. And I think, you know, this is one of the things that I want to do next, is really to sort of look at this specific group of children. And then, of course, you know, we've got another thing that has not been looked at in any great detail, is also looking, like I said, you know, different types of bilinguals. Children have got very different context of language use, you know, Polish exclusively at home and only at home, and English at school and nowhere else. Okay, but no English at home and no Polish at school, or you know, or playing with friends. Versus children, I don't know, I'm thinking, for example, of some Chinese speaking community or Pakistani heritage communities, or maybe some Arabic speaking families in the UK, where there may be a lot more to-ing and fro-ing, you know, within members of the community using both languages. This again, you know, if you have a situation in which there is more language separation, in which, for example, I only ever use English at work and I only ever speak Italian to my mom on the phone, then I don't really get a lot of interference, right, between the two. So also less co-activation and less likelihood potentially of cross-linguistic influence across languages. Okay, so I want sort of to end talking about a study that is ongoing that I'm doing with some colleagues at the University of Warwick, Kate Messengers and Marta Wizierska, and my colleague Vanessa Szyblinska at the University of Reading. So these were our questions, and basically, you know, taking this syntactic priming paradigm, our question was, can we prime syntactic constructions across languages with bilingual children, right? It's been done before a lot with bilingual adults. It's been done to some extent with bilingual children. Can we do it? Also, is priming bidirectional? And also, we really wanted to see, to get good measures of language exposure and of language proficiency to see whether they would predict the likelihood of priming. Okay, so this is our setup. So currently we've done, well, 2 studies and a half, but I'm only going to talk about one. So we tested 48 Polish English bilingual children in the UK between 5 and 9, born in the UK to Polish-speaking parents, where parents still speak Polish to children. Some children answer in Polish, some of the time, some children answer in English. So it's a bit of quite a mixed bag, right? So it's quite an unclean sample, as is very often the case with bilingual children. So we use the QBEX questionnaire that I talked to you about earlier to get a measure of relative language exposure. And then for language proficiency in both English and in Polish, we took measures of receptive vocabulary, so comprehension, and a sentence repetition task. And this was our measure of language proficiency. So we did 2 studies, one on possessive constructions, which is the one I'm going to talk about, and another one on adjectival constructions, where we compared the use of, we primed either adjectival noun phrases or relative clauses. And we also have this in a third study where we did the same thing, but in the context of a story rather than in the context of, you know, the traditional snap game where you're showing pictures. And so I'm going to show you what we did. But first I'm going to talk about possessive constructions in English and Polish, which work in, you know, fairly similar way, although the preference for one versus the other is different across the two languages. So both languages have got a possessor first construction, the equivalent of the English, the painter's watch. And they also have a possessor second construction, the equivalent of the watch of the footballer. I'm not going to go into what predicts whether you're more likely to use one versus the other of these possessive construction. There are many different determinants, but in the context of picture description, we did away with a lot of the like, you know, like the heaviness of the NP, the previous mention that could affect one or the other. So we assumed that this construct, that you could, you know, use either of these to describe that, you know, the item. So you could say, you know, the painter's watch or the watch of the painter. Okay. So just to tell you that Polish and English work in a similar way. So we had both constructions in both languages. So then what we did, okay, let's see. Oops, sorry. What's going on? Okay, so we had prime in Polish. So we did bidirectional. So we had Polish prime and English target. So children, it was a snap game. So the experimenter would describe a prime target in Polish and would say something like malarza zegarek, which is literally the painter's brush. And then the children had to describe a target, okay? So the idea was that if priming works, they should be more likely to use the same possessor first construction, i.e. they should be more likely to say the girl's cake after hearing a prime in which the order is the same in Polish, right? Rather than the other one. And same thing, when we've got the possessor after, okay? So in Polish again, the possessor comes second, then in this case, we would expect a target where children would say the cake of the girl, more likely to say that than the girl's cake if they're being primed, okay? So if word order in Polish primes word order in English, right? Okay. Sorry, I don't know what's happening with all these colors. And then the other way around, so we did the same thing in English. So you would have something like the cake of the girl, where the possessor comes second, would be more likely, should be more likely if priming takes place to elicit a Polish construction in which again the possessor comes second, as opposed to the equivalent construction in which it comes first. Okay. Again, look at these funny colors, don't ask me why. And finally, the same thing, but when the possessor comes first. You will be very disappointed, as we were, to see the findings. Okay, basically, the answer is no to all of this, right? So priming did not work. We did not find the children were more likely to reuse the same word order across languages. Because we did not get an effect of priming, of course, the answer is also no to the second question, is priming bidirectional? Well, it didn't happen in either direction. So in that case, I guess is lack of priming bidirectionally. And of course, we could not answer question 3 and 4. So because really children were not primed to any extent, we couldn't see, you know, if some children had been primed and some other children had not been primed, we could then argue maybe the children that have had more exposure to Polish were primed more, children that were more proficient in Polish were primed more, or in English, okay? So we did not get an effect of priming. These children, I have to say, sort of on average, were quite, you know, their Polish they weren't very proficient in Polish, and their language exposure, again, was on the lower end of the spectrum. And these are the children that we got. At the same time, you could argue that, at least even, in the case of these unbalanced bilingual, maybe we could have got some sort of, unidirectional priming, right? But to get some unidirectional priming, you still need, a good representation in language A, and some at least emergent representation in language B. So I think, what we could conclude, I'll tell you what we're going to do next, but what we can conclude, from these null results, and of course, it's always difficult to draw conclusions from null results, but minimally, I would say, if, to have priming, you need to have syntactic representations before they're unified, that are present in each language. This is obviously not the case. It's very likely that these children had a representation of possessive constructions, at least in English, because these are, UK-based children. But for Polish, it was emergent, perhaps, or really not well established enough to allow priming to occur. So and obviously, issues of language exposure and proficiency, clearly sort of don't make a difference yet when priming does not take place. But we think the reason is that they hadn't had enough time, they were not proficient enough, and they hadn't had enough exposure in the language to have at least an emergent representation in Polish. So the obvious thing to do next, which is what we're doing, is that we want to prime within languages, okay? So we want to see, my prediction at this stage would be that, these are children that go to school in England, these are mainstream English-speaking schools. So you would expect, and these are fairly early acquired constructions anyway. So you would expect that these children by the age, 5 to 9 would have a representation, at least in English, right, of the doctor's watch or the watch of the doctor. So replicating exactly the same kind of experiment with different children, obviously, but, roughly the same kind of population. My prediction would be that we will get priming in English, and in Polish, probably unlikely for the children of the same age with the same profile of little Polish exposure and little Polish proficiency. And that would tell us that these children still don't have a representation in one of their languages, or not enough a representation that will allow priming even within language, right? The other thing we want to do is thinking like, does it happen, right? Do these children ever get to this stage? Is there ever a time when, we can see if this happens like it's been shown to happen for adults? So we're now targeting older children, and specifically we want to make sure, because obviously the longer these children stay in an English-speaking country, the less Polish in general they will get, right? So, if anything, there'll be even more language attrition over time. So we're specifically targeting a set of the population. So these are children coming from Polish families that are studying for GCSE or A levels in Polish. So these are, school level qualifications in the language. So these are children, obviously, they will have put in quite a bit of work to be able to get this certification. So by the fact that they're still at school in England, obviously their English you would expect should be fine, but also their Polish should be, they should have more exposure and certainly more proficiency in Polish as well. So I would predict that then for these older children, we should see priming going in both directions that we didn't see with our younger cohort. And I think this is it. So watch this space and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Serratrice. It's very interesting, the idea that you talked about. Thank you so much for that. Sorry, if any one of you have questions, please raise your hand so I can give you the mic. So is there any? Okay, Haifa, here you go.
Oh, Haifa.
Yeah.
Hi Ludo, how are you?
Hi, Haifa. Nice to see you.
How are you doing?
Well, to see
nice
you, to hear you.
Yeah, well, as Dr. Lamdi said at the beginning, children under 12 are going back to school this week, and we're very excited and happy that they're going back, but at the same time, we're a bit concerned as parents. We're happy to see you today and to learn from your extensive experience in bilingualism, a topic that is becoming very important here in Saudi Arabia and actually quite controversial at times. The second or foreign language is sometimes seen as an enemy to the first language or a threat or to identity. Not only the second language or the foreign language, but also given the diglossic context situation of Arabic, colloquial regional dialects or accents are sometimes seen as a threat to modern standard Arabic. So given this diglossic situation, and knowing that parents and relatives and people around children here in Saudi Arabia and many parts of the Middle East actually, or in Arab countries, are monolingual speakers of Arabic, and the second language proficiency or the foreign language proficiency might not be high. So there's quite a debate on when to introduce a second language to children and on raising bilingual children. So I would like to hear your views on the optimal age for introducing a second language. A question that I'm sure you've heard like hundreds of times.
So you're talking about English in this case, right?
Usually the second language here or the foreign language is usually English. And are the concerns about the first language or about identity scientifically valid in your opinion?
Yeah, well, okay. So first of all, so I think, I've been talking about quite a different set of bilingual children in the sense these are children that are learning two languages as, because one of the parents speaks another language or two of the parents speak a minority language. Well, it would be the case of, two Arabic speaking parents in England, for example, right? You're talking about a situation that is a little bit different. So you're talking about instructed second language, instructed bilingualism, so to speak, right? Where children would be exposed to another language in the context of schooling. Am I right?
Yes.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So again, there is always this idea that children sort of, it really depends on, I've talked a lot about input. So it really depends on what this instructed second language means. Is it like 2 hours a week? Is it like, half a day? Is it like a dual immersion program? Because obviously, the amount of input makes a huge difference. And you can see in countries where the second language is, like 1 or 2 or 3 hours a week, and it's introduced in primary school. These children basically learn, songs and numbers, for 5 years. And then, when they're like 11, 12, they start learning. So, and then I think there's Carmen Munoz that has got like this really big study on second language learning, really showing that actually children learn when they're older, they learn much faster than children that are younger. But I'm talking about a context of instructive second language learning. So if we're talking about, naturalistic exposure, so it's a very different thing. So of course, we've also, there is a lot of evidence that there is a difference, for example, between, to some extent between simultaneous and sequential learner. The first obviously domain is phonology, but, even when it comes to phonology and morphosyntax, there are differences. If we're talking about, and I don't know what what happens in Saudi Arabia. So when children go to school, how many hours of English would they get?
Haifa, are you here? Okay, I'm not sure about. Normally, they start learning English when they were about 12 years old. Okay,
right.
But now they have changed the system. I think they started to learn English at school when they are about I think 10 years old, maybe. But let me just say, Haifa, are you here? Okay, yeah, I think
it's still there, but I think we can see it. Yeah, so it really depends. It really depends on how much these children are getting, in terms of input. Because if they're getting, like I said, 1 or 2 hours a week, or, when by the time sort of, and you start them when they're 5, when they, if they start sort of learning when they're older, they will learn everything a child will have learned, in those 5 years in a month, right? Something like that, I think.
Yeah,
well,
I think they have about like 4 classes a week. Okay. And that class lasts for about 45 minutes. And here we're talking about, the child who is about 7 years old.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, you know, this, I don't think it's going to be like doing 4 hours a week of English. I don't think it's going to sort of, you know, alienate them from their Arabic identity. I wouldn't have thought, you know, but I would also think that it's very different when you're talking about dual language immersion programs, right? So then, you know, because you are, for example, using the language to learn as well. Oh, Haifa may be back.
Yeah.
Rather than learning the language. Hi.
Sorry, I was not able to unmute myself. I'm sorry. Yeah. As Dr. Mohammed said, mostly if we're talking about public schools, just this year they started teaching English in grade 1. And as you said, 45 minutes and 4 times a week. But there are also children who study in private schools and children who study in international schools, and they're maybe exposed to English or to a foreign language for longer times.
Yeah, that's very different.
So it really varies.
Yeah, if you go to like an international school where say like English is the medium of instruction, then that's okay. I mean, it's a different thing, right? Because you also, it's CLIL basically, you know, you're also doing English to learn the subject content. So that's a very different situation when you have, like you said, you know, even 3 or 4 hours a week, 45 minutes. Yeah. What's your take on this?
Are you asking me?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's quite controversial, really, and it really, as you said, it depends on the situation of the child, and how much exposure they're being to the second language.
But also it depends what the ultimate outcome you want. I mean, if it's like in these full 45 minutes a week, you just want the children to get some sense that there are other languages other than Arabic. I mean, it's not going to do them any harm. I don't think they will speak English by the end of primary school. But yeah. Yeah,
I agree with you. Particularly what they are doing, they are basically learning the content. Okay, rather than learning, the culture or, those things that may have an effect on the identity. But that's good. So please, Professor, can I have another question from Rana? I think Rana is here. Yeah, here you go, Rana.
Rana? Hi. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you, Lodo. That was very informative and interesting overview of language development in bilingualism. To be honest, my research area is far away from bilingualism and multilingualism, but I really enjoyed listening to your lecture. My question actually is intrigued by your last slide. Your own research, the shared syntax and in bilingualism or bilingual children. I was wondering have you considered or have you read in the literature the variable of the age, whether like younger children or bilinguals tend to generalize or overgeneralize or share syntax more than older ones?
Well, the problem is that we have, like I was said, there are 4 studies that have been published. These are all studies on primary school age children. And so we don't have any evidence, using this methodology for younger children either. I think my point was that I think you need to have but this has been shown with monolingual children, and of course with monolingual children, priming sort of tends to work more with slightly older children than very young children. It's just because you cannot prime something that isn't there, right? So you need some at least emergent syntactic representation to be able to prime that. So, yeah.
Okay, nice. Yeah, go ahead.
No, Rana, if you have a question, go ahead. Yeah, that's fine.
I do have one, but let's give the chance to others.
That's fine. Okay, so when
we can come back.
Please let me know, okay?
No problem.
Okay, Al-Ghamdi, here you go, please.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Professor. It was very informative listening to you, and I mean, the issue with bilingualism, and even in Saudi to let's say Arabic-speaking parents, is that, for example, I'll talk about my case. One of my daughters 3 days ago told me that it was raining cats and dogs. Yes. So I tend to put more of the emphasis on the use of technology. And I believe I teach the use of technology to teach English for my students, and I believe one of them is among the audience. So this would be a very great example of showcasing how technology could affect and impact kids, even to Arabic speaking parents. She speaks English, there's a lot of code switching. We speak to her in Arabic, she responds in English. So amazingly, your lecture came to place and just pointed out not only the case in my house, but the case, I believe, in a lot of the younger Saudi couples where there's issues with Arabic and English. I believe English, yes, it has been the medium of their interaction, the medium of instruction in schools. And I believe they're exposed to English at least 6 hours daily. So this is why you see a lot of bilingual kids growing up and starting to code switch, use English more often than Arabic. And I believe it could be really interesting to study and see what's going on here, really.
Yeah, because I mean, this is interesting because English is not the societal language as such, but in some weird kind of way, it's kind of almost taking over, right? So you would think, so that's an interesting thing. I mean, the things that we talked about, English is a very weird language anyway, because it's got this, global social status, right? So that's also, I think, music is, pop culture, music, blockbuster films, everything is in English. So I think it's also got that status that really elevates it beyond what it should be, really, in a way. So I think it's quite special in that respect, I think, right? Indeed. I don't know if you see, maybe your children are still too young for that kind of culture. I don't know, but I would have thought that.
They're not. They're not.
No, they're not. No.
Thank you very
They're growing fast.
That's fine. Shall we have another question, please? Noor?
Yes, hello.
Yeah, we hear you.
Unfortunately, I caught the last part of the lecture, but I have to add here that Arabic students, especially in all Arabic countries, especially in Saudi Arabia, they don't speak classic Arabic language. So when they enter schools, they learn how to speak the classic. Mm-hmm. And they learn the second language, English language. So how much this kind of learning can competing, and which one do you think that students could acquire one of them better?
What are you comparing? Sorry.
Is it the classic Arabic language or the international language, which is English nowadays? Here in Saudi Arabia, we speak a dialect or dialects. When our children go to schools, they learn how to speak classic, mm-hmm. which is written academic language.
Yeah.
So it's kind of learning another thing.
It's a diglossic situation, right? Yeah. So you've got modern standard Arabic and then your local variety of Arabic. Yeah. So it's classic diglossic situation.
I'm thinking, does English, or any other foreign language interfere learning this standard Arabic, or can affect somehow?
Well, I mean, in a way, anything that you learn will have an effect on stuff that you already know, right? So this is also the nature of knowledge, that I don't think you can silence knowledge, very neatly, very discreetly in, this is what I know about modern standard Arabic. This is what I know about, Gulf Arabic. This is what I know about English. This is not what I know about French. So inevitably, these things to some extent will affect each other. But I think, it goes back to what we were saying earlier. It really depends on how, in the case of our colleagues that was talking about, his children sort of speaking, replying English when he speaks Arabic to them. I mean, these children are getting a lot of English at school. If you're doing, like an hour a week, that's probably not a big deal. But also, as I was saying, we're still thinking, going back to the monolingual mindset, you can also say the bilingual mindset versus the multilingual mindset. I mean, we know that the mind, can cope with more than one language, more than two, more than three. I don't know what the upper limit is, but we've got examples, in sub-Saharan Africa, in India, in a lot of countries where people juggle. I mean, Malaysia, I mean, people doing, 3 languages for very different things on a daily basis. And that's completely not a problem. I mean, you can sort of come up with the odd, cross-linguistic interference, but that's fine, right? Because who says it's a problem in a way? It's a problem when you're thinking that you have to speak, each language like a monolingual, whatever, this monolingual idealized speaker might be. So I personally don't see it as a problem. And I think, there is a lot of evidence in the literature that children can cope. I mean, we don't have enough research on trilingual, multilingual development as we've got on bilingual, and we don't have, as much bilingual, research as we have already on monolingual acquisition, because it's also difficult research to do, right? Finding your participants, making sure that they fit your certain inclusion criteria is not easy. So it's hard research to do, but it's necessary, because I think, some of these are empirical questions still, but I wouldn't worry in that respect. I think, you can sort of, children are very plastic and malleable, they can cope.
Thank you so much. Let's just go to...
excuse me, something to add. I feel kind of it is more easier to acquire classic Arabic because there is a resemblance in our dialects than the foreign language, any foreign language. Do you think so?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, when we were talking about typological distance, I don't know if you were here already or not. Clearly, of course, say a child that is learning, 2 varieties of Arabic, it'll be much easier than, because there are a lot of words that are very similar, a lot of syntactic constructions that are very similar. So clearly that's an advantage, right? So a diagnostic situation is a very special kind of bilingual situation. So yeah, that's...
Anyway, thank you so much, Noor. Can I move to another, please? Rawia, can we still, please, we just need 1 or 2 questions more, and we can just say, yeah, there you go.
Okay. Hello.
There you go, please.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
yes.
Of course. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. My question is a little bit different from the lovely colleagues. Firstly, thank you for your presentation. I enjoyed it a lot. I grew up as a trilingual child. I'm Pakistani and I grew up in the Middle East, so I spoke English and Urdu at home with my parents, and English and Arabic. Outside my home, I spoke to my friends or my colleagues at school in Arabic or English. So a quick answer to the question, yes, it is possible to grow up trilingual. However, my question is about communities living abroad, whether it was here in the Middle East or in the UK, who speak a home language, and where the attitude of the parents may impact children acquiring their home language. So what I've seen in Pakistani communities abroad is that some parents may not be as keen to teach their children Urdu or Pashto or whatever language they speak at home. So will eventually the language die out? Like, is that a possibility that the heritage or home language eventually falls out of use and that these communities stop speaking the home language and speak the societal language only?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, not in the world. Clearly, thankfully, there's still a lot of people in Pakistan that speak, Urdu, Punjabi, whatever. So,
I mean, outside of Pakistan.
Yeah, sure.
Like let's say a Pakistani family living here in Saudi Arabia or in the UK. Over the course of generations, does Urdu or Punjabi or Pashto fall out of use?
Yes. Sadly, yes. So sadly, the answer is yes. You see, again, of course, in the UK, Pakistani heritage families, they've been here now for I'd say probably 3, sometimes 4 generations.
Yes, exactly.
So you inevitably see this loss of language transmission. as I was saying, there is, especially because these are languages that don't have any support.
Yes.
For example, now there are a little bit like pockets here and there, but unfortunately, this is quite ridiculous. Like in the UK, where the most spoken languages are Polish, and then Urdu and Gujarati. The languages that are typically taught in schools and modern foreign languages are French, German, and Spanish, when in fact these are not the community.
They're not the languages spoken in the community.
No, exactly.
Right?
So, but we won't go into that because there are many historical colonial reasons why that is the case. But anyway, I'm not going to go into that. So yeah, so I would say, so the problem is that passing on, as you will, all of you who are bilingual and multilingual parents, passing on a language that is a minority language. And even, if you tell me what's happening in Saudi, the fact that, your children start answering back in English to you, maintaining a language is a lot of work, right? A lot of investment, a lot of, resources and capital. And when families only, again, I think, the larger these local communities are, the more likely it is, because children obviously really also look at their peers for language maintenance, and the more people of their age use that language, the more they're likely to pass that on. When you've got like the majority, and I see, for example, this with Polish children in schools in the UK, there are some schools where there are a lot of Polish children, and these children will start speaking Polish even in the playground, right? You've got a community of speakers there. If you've got like the isolated Polish child, the isolated Pakistani child, they don't have anyone else to talk to, so inevitably all their peers speak English, they start speaking English. They go home, the parents speak Urdu or Punjabi or Mirpuri, and they'll start answering back in English. So very sadly, yes, second generation and third generation language maintenance is really hard. That's sad. This is why you need, community support. There are cases of language revitalization. I'm thinking, for example, of Basque in the Basque country, and they've done a phenomenal job of supporting the language, phenomenal job. And there are like, now sort of, or Welsh in Wales, or Gaelic in Scotland. So there are examples of language revitalization, but that has to be at the level of a whole country that puts resources behind that. So for example, complementary schools do like a fantastic job, and they basically fill the gap where parents need extra support outside of the home. And I think they're really, really important. Complementary, supplementary schools, that some of them are religious schools as well, but some are not. But yeah, it's sadly, Rabiha, yeah, that's what happens.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, I think I have one question, but let me just take Sumaya, and then we will have the last question. Here you go, Sumaya. Yeah. Sumaya.
Okay, hello everyone.
Hi.
Thank you for this informative session. Thank you, Professor Ludo. And I really second your opinion. I'm a person who grew up speaking I grew up in a multilingual community. So my parents spoke Tibetan language. Tibetan language is a language spoken in Tibet. A long time ago, our ancestors, they immigrated from Tibet due to the political circumstances forced by China. So they immigrated to Saudi Arabia and they settled down. So I think I'm a representative for the 5th or the 4th generation of the Tibetan language speaking community. So the language is really dying out, and I'm doing my dissertation on this topic specifically. I'm doing language shift and maintenance on Tibetan language. So yes, it's dying due to the force imposed by the dominant language, which is Arabic language. Be it the modern Arabic language or the informal Arabic, the colloquial Arabic. So yeah, Tibetan language is dying, despite whatever my parents, they tried to pass it down to us. By us, I mean me and my siblings. But unfortunately, I think I'm the only person, or I'm the only child who was able to acquire that language. I'm speaking it, but I'm speaking it in a very weird and weak accent. So when I compare my Tibetan language to my parents' language, I noticed that it has acquired the accent of the Arabic language.
It's inevitable. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's inevitable. That's true. I second your opinion. This is what I wanted to add. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you for your contribution. That was very moving as well.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I'm doing my research on that area, specifically language maintenance and shift. So this is interesting. Thank you for bringing this up to our attention.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Let's just have only this last question. Sorry, I was just thinking about language contacts and bilingualisms. What I noticed, to be honest, in one of my recent research, which is under review in Phonetica, is that we see that there are effects that speakers' bilingual practices have on the language they use. And that is really clear in the Arabic dialects. If you look at them carefully, you will see that the non-native speakers of Arabic have an effect on that. And then people get confused between, well, okay, how can we separate between language contact and bilingualisms? How we can just, make things like separate? And that is, do you have any thoughts on that? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think language content also affects diachronic change, right? In a way.
Yeah.
So again, it's sort of how do you, where you could say like, how do you have like, could you compare, I don't know, like the Arabic spoken in Saudi Arabia before migration, for example, in a way.
Yeah,
you think, could you do something like this? I mean, in a way.
Quite difficult.
Yeah, exactly. So would you be able to do that? So I think it's and obviously, but all of us who are linguists here, I think what we really also appreciate is the dynamic evolution of language, right? Language doesn't stay still, right? It's forever changing, and it's constantly changing. So that's just a natural result of the fact that language is spoken by people. Then people have got lived experiences that are affected by migration, are affected by having children. They may or may not speak 2-3 languages, or maybe just one. They don't speak their own heritage language anymore. So I think it's a complex. That is why sort of doing work on bilingualism is very interesting, but also very challenging. So maybe I focus more on the opportunities than the challenges, but but still I think it's the important work that we should.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you so much, Professor, for this wonderful talk. And we really enjoyed that. And thank you so much for accepting our invitation. I really didn't know how I thank you.
It's been my pleasure. So many interesting questions, such a lively audience, and good to see Haifa that I knew already, and to meet and Rana, of course.
Thank you so much. I know some of you might have questions, but please, if you have questions, you can email that questions to I think she'll be happy to answer that. I'm really sorry. I think we are running out of the time. Anyway, we'll see you. Inshallah. In the coming meeting, inshallah. Okay. Have a good night. Thank you.
See you soon. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.